I'll start off by welcoming everybody very warmly to the first lecture in our series on how to interpret images, a theme that we were just discussing with Christina and Stephanie. It's one of my favorite themes to pitch to people because it's so interesting to hear other people's interpretations of images, but also their methodology, how they actually go about working on images and making sense of them, and especially how those change with different bodies of images, but also different schools of thought that are current in different countries or have come about through different schooling experiences. So we start off with this one lecture, which I'll come back to in a second and pass over to Christina to introduce. But we invited a number of people who work on art in the what used to be called the Near East, but we're now calling the MENA area or West Asia and the Mediterranean world, and invited them to join this series in order to compare collectively their approaches to the interpretation of art. I think we'll all get quite a lot out of it. And so without further ado, Christina, I don't think that there's anything else that I need to say, except for the fact that if you look in the chat, you will see that there's a note that joining ARWA is free for 2024. That may be especially of interest to students. And the whole series of lectures can be seen through the link to the PDF. That's second in the text, second in the chat. And if you want to see other lecture series that appear under the ARWA Academy, because it's not just the history of art and visual studies series of lectures, but there are also series of lectures on Anatolia and Mesopotamia, and all kinds of other things. So you can peruse what's on offer using the third link that's in the chat. And at this point, I will pass over to Christina to introduce our speaker, who has so graciously accepted our invitation.
Yeah, so hello from me, and we're very honored to have Professor Stephanie Langin-Hooper with us today. Professor Langin-Hooper is the Karl Kilinski II Endowed Chair in Hellenic Visual Culture at the Department of Art History at the Southern Methodist University. And her work has focused on miniature art, and especially terracotta figurines from Hellenistic Babylonia, on which she published her book with Cambridge University Press in 2020, if I'm not mistaken. Am I correct, Stephanie?
Yes, that's correct.
And also on the same topics, she has published an excellent volume, an edited volume, together with Rebecca, was it with Rebecca?
Rebecca Martin.
With Rebecca Martin, yes, which was published in 2018 with Oxford University Press. And it also included information on fragmentation and unfinished objects, which was also very interesting. It has some very interesting chapters in it. And today, she will talk to us about interpreting miniaturization and the effects of scale in Mesopotamian art. So we are very happy to have her here with us today. And over to you, Stephanie.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you so much, Catherine and Christina, for this very kind invitation. I'm honored to speak to you all today on this topic, and I look forward to hearing any comments at the end. All right. Small-scale artworks are often overlooked as relatively insignificant in the study of Mesopotamian art. Despite our discipline's widespread acknowledgement of the importance of artworks like figurines, statuettes, and cylinder seals, the Mesopotamian artistic canon, as represented by textbooks and class lectures, remains fixed on the big things: architecture, wall reliefs, stelae, monuments. Many small-scale artworks, such as coins or seals, are often augmented with artificially enlarged imagery when they are taught, studied, and displayed in museums. The idea here seems to be that enlarging an artwork to a more monumental size will indicate that object's importance to a modern audience and compel them to engage appropriately with due gravitas to its subject matter. I sympathize with the needs of museum curators and university professors, of which I am one, to communicate with their audiences in terms that they can understand. Reframing the visual parameters of miniature art into larger scales is one way to do this. Yet we should be clear that such enlargements are a type of translation into a different type of visual language, which encodes these artworks according to our culturally situated values of what types of object presence qualify as worthy of attention. So for my talk today, I would like us to instead contemplate what it might mean to take these small things seriously as small, regarding their size not as an indication of lesser status or an impediment to their appreciation, but as an integral part of their affective properties as artworks. A scale-focused approach on miniature artworks from Mesopotamia can illuminate the relationship these objects were meant to create with the people who use them. I will explore themes of embodiment, sensory perception, intimacy, and wonder through case studies of figurines and seals from the Hellenistic period in Babylonia. The Hellenistic period in Babylonia, which is in southern Iraq, begins with the conquest of the Persian Empire by Alexander the Great, followed by the establishment of the Seleucid Kingdom. During this period, large numbers of Greek and Macedonian people immigrated into Babylonia, introducing Greek cultural forms such as theaters, coinage, and Hellenistic-style statuary. Traditional Babylonian institutions also continued to thrive, and indeed, many of the Babylonian temples experienced a Hellenistic-era renaissance, rebuilt and expanded with money and support from the Seleucid kings. Overall, Hellenistic Babylonia can be characterized as a richly multicultural environment, with an interest in, respect for, and even blending between local Mesopotamian traditions and classical imports from the Mediterranean. Now, many of the objects that facilitated these cross-cultural encounters, indeed much of the artistic corpus of Hellenistic Babylonia, were miniatures. These small-scale artworks included figurines, seals and seal impressions, coins and jewelry, as well as furniture attachments, utensils, mirrors, and other items. Although archaeologists during excavation will often group such objects together as, quote, small finds, they are usually studied and published separately by specialists. Some objects, such as figurines, are routinely thought of as miniatures, while others, such as coins, are almost never thought about through the lens of the small scale. Yet I suggest that this is a productive approach to all of these types of objects. So, how to begin? Looking at these figurines, the first thing that one notices is its subject matter. Who or what is this object intended to represent? Such analysis of iconography, type, and motif is very similar to how one would study a representational artwork at any scale, such as a life-size statue. But there are several ways in which miniature scale changes and inflects how the artwork represents that subject matter. To pursue this, the next step I would take is to examine the size of the object in relationship to my body, particularly my hand. Picking up a figurine is crucial. Hold it in your hands, manipulate it, twist it, and often you will find that it settles into a comfortable grasping spot. Some figurines do this more easily than others, which in turn gives an indication of which figurines were intended to be held on a regular basis and which were intended to be seen from more of a distance. For example, the figurine of a horse rider seen here looks from a distance as if the body was made with a relatively small torso and elongated legs. The body seems to lack hips, with a smooth transition between the thin waist and the spreading legs. Seeing this figurine in a photograph or behind glass, and thus as a purely visual object, perhaps with no indication of its scale, one might come up with theories about the symbolism of such distortions. Some of those ideas might even be accurate, but they aren't fully informed. It is only upon picking up this figurine and feeling how your fingers slide comfortably around the waist, nestling easily onto the top of the legs, that the proportions of the object begin to make sense. An even more striking example of what looks like bodily distortion, a very narrow waist and wide hips, can be seen here, which, as you see on the photo on the right, allows the figurine to perfectly accommodate the grasp. We tend to think of figurines through an exclusively representational lens, or when we think of them as functional, it is usually in terms of high-level conceptual functions such as votive offering or decoration. But I would suggest that to understand the miniature, you also need to think about the in-the-moment functionality of a figurine as it accommodates or fails to accommodate practical concerns such as the ability for the hand to pick it up. Of course, such practical functions are also meaningful, facilitating or even superseding broad use categories such as votive or decorative. A figurine like this one that easily accommodates the human hand, indeed seems made to be grabbed by someone's fingers, invites its user to enter into an alternate version of reality. In this reality, real-looking things are tiny, so the human user feels that his or her body is larger than it should be. The idea of one's own body being too large could be a destabilizing or even disturbing feeling. But many miniatures counteract such potential alienation by their openness to human encounter. In other words, miniatures don't just represent a tiny version of reality, but they also ask us, everyday, quote unquote, normal sized people, to enter into that world. Figurines can be appealing and useful to their owners because they allow people to view and touch tiny versions of powerful real world forces, like kings and gods, that were made non-threatening and controllable through miniaturization. Figurines like these of horse riders, who are often soldiers, were popular in Hellenistic Babylonia. My hand in this photograph shows how an ancient person might have held the rider figurine to place it onto the back of a terracotta horse, an action which allows the user to participate in the riding of the horse. Through this interaction, the person could pretend to be a soldier, or perhaps pretend to be the person who controls the soldier, or even controls the army itself. Children might have used such figurines to replicate glorious battle stories or mimic the professional occupations of an adult relative. For an adult, such figurines could be personal symbol of military involvement, or a more generic representation of the wars that commonly affected the people of Hellenistic Babylonia. Now, this suggestion of both childhood and adult uses for these figurines is consistent with their archaeological context. Soldier and horseman figurines were found in both votive and domestic contexts, as well as in the graves of both adults and children, going back to the earliest Hellenistic period levels. This diversity of context suggests a shared need for such miniatures throughout a broad segment of the population. But what need were such soldiers and horsemen fulfilling? This is an example, I suggest, of the power that miniatures grant us by virtue of our larger scale to be masters of their tiny worlds. This power may have been especially potent with figurines dealing with such a threatening subject as war. Taking physical control over a miniature soldier and his steed also miniaturizes the battle represented, making it seem smaller, more understandable, and more manageable. The ancient person could choose to put the soldier on the horse and thus send him into battle, or leave the horse in his stable. In the real world, that power is held only by the king and his generals. But in the less threatening and more predictable world of miniatures, that is a power you can take for yourself. But not all miniatures allow this sort of tactile access. If a figurine does not seem to fit well in the hand, I also experiment very carefully, I assure you, for the museum curators who are listening, who've allowed me to work with their collection. So very carefully, I experiment with standing the figurine in various positions. Can it stand on its own? Is it stable and well balanced? Surprisingly, some figurines that look as if they have solid bases will rock back and forth or even lean at a precarious angle, suggesting that contrary to how they appear visually, experientially, they were not necessarily seen in a mode of upright display. Other figurines will be very stable and secure when stood upright. For terracotta figurines, I also suggest looking carefully at the thickness of the clay of the object. Many figurines were made with thick, spreading flanges of clay at the bottom or at the back that might look incongruous and sloppy, but when you balance the figurine upright, what appears to be excess clay actually stabilizes an object that might otherwise fall over. For figurines made in the double mold that are hollow inside, like this one, you can see it because it's broken, the thicker the clay walls are, the more likely that the figurine can stand upright and securely. Not always, but it can often help. Such figurines suggest that a more distanced mode of viewing and less tactile handling was how they were intended to be experienced. Many Hellenistic Babylonian figurines representing a heavily draped female figure with her arm held to her chest have this sort of vertical stability. Terracotta figurines of this type typically do not have any attributes that indicate an identity for this figure. But similar versions in alabaster and marble often have crescent moon pendants that indicate that at least some versions of this figure represented the syncretized goddess Artemis Nanaya. Some of these figurines were found in graves, while others are found in domestic refuse. There is no secure archaeological context that gives evidence for a household or other type of shrine in which this goddess was worshipped. But here I suggest that the miniature object is itself providing evidence through its materiality of how it was intended to be experienced, visually, at a distance, not touched, in a way that indicates that a shrine use is possible. Now, one might say that this is obvious, since this figurine's appearance, her type, and her iconography suggests her identification as a goddess. Yet figurines in terracotta and alabaster that depict the goddess Ishtar Aphrodite are made very differently. The most obvious visual difference is, of course, the nude body of this goddess, the goddess of sex, in comparison with the heavily clothed body of the more modest other goddess, a difference which would remain whether the figure was 6 inches tall or 6 feet tall. But what really distinguishes the figurines of Ishtar Aphrodite is their inducement to tactile handling, which only works because they are miniatures. The tiny feet of this goddess form an unstable base for an object that cannot stand alone. When made in terracotta, the double molded walls of these figurines were modeled to a fragile shell-like thinness, which further emphasizes the delicacy and fragility of the object. The exaggerated hip-to-waist ratio, like that of the horse riders discussed earlier, conforms well to the human's hand's ability to touch and grasp. The smoothness of the alabaster and fine terracotta encourage the thumb to caress the figure's torso, breasts, and buttocks. The jointed arms, which can slightly move and wiggle, further encourage tactile interaction. In sum, this tiny goddess entices a life-size person to enter into an intimate relationship, one in which the power dynamic would seem to be tipped in favor of the person, who is not only granted the access and freedom to touch another body, but to touch a tiny version of a goddess, who should normally be cosmically powerful. But because of this inversion of scale, over whom the mere human now can exercise power and control. This possibility of intimacy is seductive and alluring, and for many scholars, they explain that these feelings and potentials account for the widespread appeal of tiny objects to many people across many societies. Most current approaches to miniaturization take as their origin point the 1984 publication of On Longing, Narratives of the Miniature, the Gigantic, the Souvenir, and the Collection by Susan Stewart. This book was one of the first to specifically explore how scale conditions the way in which people perceive, think about, describe, and engage with the world. Stewart argued that all miniatures had similar effects: the compression of time, focus on interiority, and suspension of narrative action in favor of descriptive detail. What Bachelard, writing before Stewart, just called, quote, a daydream of a life within a life, end quote. Similar ideas are still being explored today, such as in this article published in The Atlantic just last week. In both scholarly discussions and the popular writing like this based upon them, the small details of miniature objects are thought to encourage close looking and handling, invoking experiences of familiarity, affection, attachment, and inducing what Lloyd and Sloan describe as, quote, a dreamy reverie of contemplation, gaze, touch, and desire, end quote. In my previous work, I have similarly utilized this intimacy approach to explain the broad appeal of figurines throughout Hellenistic Babylonia. In particular, I argued the intimacy of figurines made them accessible and non-threatening role models for individuals who were processing social change and remaking their personal identities in the face of Greek immigration and widespread cross-cultural interaction in Hellenistic Babylonia. Yet I now propose that this intimacy was more of a seductive possibility than an automatic feature of figurines, and that the ways in which Hellenistic Babylonian figurines could create and then disrupt the illusion that they were intimate invitations into tiny worlds provokes a more distancing sensation, which I will understand through the lens of wonder, which will emerge over the course of the rest of this talk. Close looking and touching revealed small details on terracotta figurines, but also visible fingerprints, such as are circled on the back of this figurine, or other mark making. The disconcerting effect of such marks can be seen on a standing female figurine. The raised line of the join between the front and the back half of the double mold of this double molded figurine, where it shows where it was sealed together before firing. This indicates a less than ideal fit between these two molded pieces of clay. Some attempt was made to smooth the joint, especially at the lower legs and elbow. However, the result of this effort introduced an unnatural bluntness to the point of the elbow, a flattening which is also seen in the frontal view. Additionally, even if the two halves of this figurine had been joined more accurately and the seam was better disguised, the depth of the figurine would still have been greater than would be convincing for a female body of this narrow frontal width. We might consider that mold lines, fingerprints, and smoothed edges on terracotta figurines evidence the creation of the miniature object by larger scale human hands. This intrusion disrupted the illusion of intimacy. Even if a user handled the figurine in private, the artist remained noticeably and persistently present. Mold marks in particular also signaled the mass-produced nature of a figurine that was serially manufactured in a workshop and publicly sold, thereby reminding the user that the parameters of his or her experience with the miniature object were shared with other members of the community. The elaborate clothing and high double bud hairstyle worn by this standing female figurine introduced fashions common across the Hellenistic world into a Babylonian home. But it also suggested that many other people in the community were similarly admiring and engaging with these trends. I argue that the unpredictable aspects of miniaturization were crucial in inducing the communities of Hellenistic Babylonia to accept and use such figurines, and in the process to accept and internalize the particular versions of social life that the figurines represented. The figurine seen here offers a seemingly intimate window into an affectionate scene of a mother cradling her baby. The nursing mother motif had been popular among Mesopotamian figurines since the 3rd millennium BCE, but its depiction of a contrapposto pose and complex folds of drapery, this figurine was also in close dialogue with other child-carrying figurines of the broader Hellenistic world. Such iconographic hybridity opened space in Hellenistic Babylonian society for women, particularly mothers, and the children they raised to also formulate new multicultural identities. Yet the warmth and inclusiveness seen in the frontal view of this figurine was strikingly contrasted by its back. Although made in a double mold that would have allowed for elaboration, the backside of the object follows only the vaguest contours of the human figure. In this, the figurine echoes earlier Babylonian traditions of single molded figurines that were detailed on the front but flat and unmodeled on the back. Such single molded figurines were still made and used in Hellenistic Babylonia. The mother and child figurine seen here is thus hybrid not only in motif and style but also technology. A Greek double mold was used to make a figurine that was more or less like the product of a Babylonian single mold. That this was a cross-cultural negotiation between technologies is particularly highlighted by the circular impression on the figurine's back, seen here. This is a cutting guideline used on double molded figurines, which, if perforated, would have allowed hot air to escape the hollow figurine during firing. Yet this guideline was neither cut nor smoothed away. The figurine's back remained solid, like a Babylonian figurine, but with visible traces of a potential yet unrealized whole as a reminder of Greek technologies and craft traditions. Bearing witness to its artist's negotiation of two cultures colliding, this figurine compelled its user to similarly juggle a paradox of opposites, Greek versus Babylonian, the closeness and stability of maternal love versus evolving geopolitics and shifting social dynamics, the intimacy offered by a small-scale figure versus the distancing reminders of the life-size world and its complications. I propose that such paradoxes were what brought Hellenistic Babylonian people back to the figurines again and again. The prospect of intimacy with these most quintessential miniatures encouraged people to bring the figurine into their personal space, into the palm of the hand, within inches of the eyes, in the hope and expectation that the tiny thing might reveal its secrets. Yet this intimacy was not completely reciprocated by the figurine. Distant and beguiling, figurines could be stubbornly insistent on their place within the social landscape as manufactured objects with the capability of real-world action. This scalar duality was alluring as well as agentive. The motifs and iconography of Hellenistic Babylonian figurines offered carefully negotiated suggestions for acceptable personal identities and social roles, which were often culturally hybrid in form and sensitive to both Greek and Babylonian traditions. The figurine's ability to act and exist in the real world implied that its multiculturalism was already real, located simultaneously out there in the community, as well as in here within the miniature world of the tiny. Figurines allowed experimentation with intimate concepts such as fashion and self-presentation, aspirations and dreams, interpersonal relationships, and the structure of family life. But the mold marks and the fingerprints reminded their users that these personal identity formulations were taking place against the backdrop of community values and trends. It was likely comforting to know that other people were experimenting with the same new ideas, similarly negotiating cultural tensions and experiencing the same worries. So in studying small-scale objects of all types, I propose that we need to think more complexly and add wonder in addition to intimacy as an analytical lens to explore what miniatures do and how miniatures entice people. Now, in making this proposal, I'm drawing heavily upon recent scholarship that interprets Hellenistic miniature artworks in light of Hellenistic era texts, most particularly the Lithica poem series by Pisidippus, that describes the unique sensory and emotional experiences created by small-scale objects. In analyzing these poems, Catherine Gutzweiler has argued that a primary value of miniature imagery for a Hellenistic audience was the way it compressed large-scale themes, such as the physical nature of the cosmos, into an accessible, observable size. Michael Squire, in his analysis of miniature Iliad tablets, has similarly remarked on the thoroughly Hellenistic concern with combining the minute with the massive. James Porter proposes that the appeal of such juxtapositions was not simply about small-scale refinement, but also the tension produced through this paradoxical contrast of opposites. Tension and paradox is also a theme in Verity Platt's work, as she argues that the miniature images on Hellenistic seals demanded intimacy in viewing, but the careful study they require allows the significance of tiny images to expand until they occupy huge dimensions within the mind. Details of these images can challenge or even elude sensory perception altogether, as Pisidippus describes in the case of a carved stone where, quote, you wouldn't see the chariot except in the imprint or feel a crease on the surface. And you can see this here in two different photos of a seal where I only turn the object just a tiny bit, and you can see how the image disappears and becomes just a crease, a scratch, a hole, instead of a miniature. Now, in my book on figurines, I described such dilemmas as a refusal of intimacy by the miniature. Squire presents them as a paradox of authority, wherein the human user exerts both physical dominance and an omnipotent viewpoint on the object, but the miniature still retains the power to challenge that authority and slip through our fingers. I now suggest that the sensory and perceptual effects of miniatures that are highlighted by Hellenistic craftsmanship and discussed by Hellenistic writers are not unique to Hellenistic small-scale art. So I invite all of you to think about these paradoxes and use some of these constructs. I don't think it's unique to the Hellenistic period. Rather, I propose that the Hellenistic artists and writers and the modern scholars who analyze them have revealed something fundamental about how miniaturization works in general, which I label as wonder. Now, I know there's a lot of text on this slide. Feel free to screenshot it if you want to, but I thought this was a sort of useful comparison of how we can theorize miniaturization, or how I theorize miniaturization, as a tension between intimacy and wonder. So intimacy, we've already gone through earlier in this talk, how miniatures encourage close looking and handling. Their small details mean you have to have close bodily proximity to experience them in many cases. They can invoke experiences of familiarity, affection, and attachment. And when they have powerful high status subject matter, they offer an immersive escapism, access to and power over the otherwise inaccessible. But wonder is created when miniature objects are sufficiently small, delicate, and detailed to suggest the possibility of an intimate encounter, but they also include reminders that the miniature is still an object created in the life-size world. So it is both part of the tiny world and part of our world, thus complicating the experience of immersive escapism, and instead creating an unexpected and destabilizing experience. The characteristics that create such paradoxes could include the compression of gigantic subject matter into a small-scale object, a significant aesthetic impact of the object despite its small size, marks of the artist's tools or hands, emphasis on the materiality of the object, scalar inconsistency within the small-scale imagery, or a resistance of miniature imagery to full sensory exploration despite the user's possession of the object as a whole. The requisite combination of scales necessary to make an object miniature. To be a miniature, you have to be a smaller version of something bigger out there in the world. You can't just be a tiny thing. You have to be a smaller version of something else. But that means that paradoxical features of one sort or another are almost always unavoidable. It has to be both tiny and refer to the big. And thus, if wonder-provoking features are intrinsic to miniaturization, then the experience of wonder with miniatures may be nearly as universal. Now, to explore this concept further, I turn now to a discussion of Hellenistic Babylonian seals and seal impressions. The design of nearly every privately owned seal in Hellenistic Babylonia contained a miniature image. On the seal stone itself, the miniature image was carved in inverse, appearing as a surface indentation. Indeed, it can be particularly hard to see, and especially to identify fine details, on a seal stone, unless the light is hitting the stone at precisely the correct angle. Indeed, seals were only fully realized, both as miniature images and in their functional capacity, when impressed into the clay of a cuneiform tablet or document wrapper called a bulla. The power to create images in infinite replication, such as repeated impressions from a single seal, held cosmic significance in Mesopotamia. The fact that the imagery on Hellenistic Babylonian seals was miniaturized would have intensified this sense of godlike authority, particularly because many of the seals depicted gods or animals and other symbols connected with gods. Seals not only enabled their users to bring forth a divine presence whenever, wherever, as often as they liked, but they also granted their users a scalar superiority and dominance over the god that was produced. Yet even in their final impressed form, seals as miniatures still did not offer self-contained visual completeness, nor invite full entry into their tiny worlds. Rather, their materiality on bulla and tablets continually disrupted the illusion of miniaturization, issuing forceful reminders of real-scale people and their social life. Fingerprints and other marks of manufacture cover the bullae. See, for instance, the noticeable ridges and swirls that surround the image of Odysseus here. Rather than surface imperfections on the miniature, as in the case of figurines, such fingerprints on tablets and bullae reminded the user that the seal miniatures were themselves surface marks, similarly created through touch and pressure. Insufficient pressure, a worn seal, an unsteady hand, or carelessness easily resulted in a blurry or partial seal impression, seen, for instance, on the far left here as compared to the other three, which are far crisper. This further disrupted the illusionistic potential of the miniature and reminded the viewer of the imperfect human process of creating the impressed images. The alignment of seal impressions on tablets and bullae similarly produced this kind of exteriority, as their miniature landscapes were without narrative arc or consistency of scale, or in this case, as you can see, orientation. Indeed, seal impressions on bullae even particularly lack a visual logic to the orientation and placement of the seals, and thus of the tiny figures. So you can see the really large head of a woman right next to and tilted in comparison to the much tinier representation of the goddess Athena. This absence of visual coherence had a positive functional resonance. It prevented any illusion of spatial recession within the images of the seal impressions from challenging the physical integrity of the tablet or a bulla as object. The pleasure of the surface, and these sort of insistently show that they are surfaces. The pleasure of the surface is a pleasure of immediacy. As Jonathan Hay has argued, images that are created as surface-level veneers focus attention on exteriority and point toward the outside world, rather than encouraging you to look deeper inward. Handling and rotating a bulla or tablet brought new impressions into view, with new orientations and scales, further reinforcing this sense of a non-illusionistic landscape. The clay surface became a wonderland, a no place, reinforcing the reality of the life-size hands that made it, rather than the tiny gods and supernatural creatures who populated it. This power of world-making was perhaps the ultimate wonder, a surprising and awe-inspiring ability of seal users to, in collaboration with other people and other seals, create realms that paradoxically could not be entered or even fully understood by their makers. Such acts of impressing a seal constituted new communities at both the miniature scale across the surface of a tablet or bulla and in the life-size real world. The clay of Hellenistic Babylonian tablets and bullae had to be sealed relatively quickly by 10 to 20 participants in the transaction before the clay dried and became impermeable. Substantial groups of people united in common purpose were assembled to participate, a creation of community that was mobilized, indeed demanded, in part by the materiality of the objects themselves. This world-building capability of seals would have been particularly urgent, noticeable, and real in Hellenistic Babylonia. In the second half of the first millennium BCE, the Mesopotamian practice of writing in Akkadian on cuneiform tablets was dying out. The Hellenistic era tablets represent a last effort to keep the tradition alive. On the other hand, the widespread use of bullae, including by government administrators and tax collectors, adjusted the ancient Mesopotamian practice of sealing in clay to suit the new needs of a new era of paper-based administration. The community-building resonance of the act of sealing in this environment of social change may explain why Hellenistic Babylonian economic record-keeping practices differed from earlier periods. It used to be that to buy or sell property, you only needed a few witnesses, but in this time, far more witnesses to transactions were required, up to 40 in some cases, meaning that more people are in the room, more seals are being used, more people are seeing those seals and those designs in use. So the ability of seals to create these illusions of worlds in miniature suggested that tablets and bullae were in fact places where worlds, even the real social world, the real community, could be made. The wonder of the miniature made these communities and their multiculturalism more permanent and enduring. The imagery used on Hellenistic Babylonian seals was diverse in cultural origin, much like the actual human communities that produced the impressions. The motifs of individual seals were usually either Greek or Mesopotamian, rather than culturally hybrid, and replicated publicly acceptable symbols of power from royal, monumental, and official cult practice. But on this bullae, Odysseus and Psyche, figures from Greek mythology, literally rub shoulders with Babylonian priests and astrological creatures. On the edge of this cuneiform tablet, a winged lamassu, which is more associated with Neo-Assyrian art, that one's right here, strides alongside symbols of Hellenistic period Babylonian temple astronomy. We have the constellations Leo and Cancer right here, which in turn are alongside a Greek-style portrait. So even though individual seal owners were mostly unwilling to personally own a hybrid image of cultural identity in this public, official, enduring format of their seal, but when they used the seals all together, the tiny worlds they assembled by impressing their seals alongside the seals of other people did in fact reflect the multiculturalism of this community. Now, long after the original participants in these transactions were no longer living, their children and grandchildren might consult these impressed texts to verify land ownership or divide inheritance. The idea that seal imagery continues to signal personal identity, even as it travels outside the physical orbit or lifespan of the original owner, has been understood by many scholars, including Jonah Ruse, Marian Feldman, and Emily Anderson, through the construction of extended personhood. I argue that the wonder-provoking qualities of miniaturization intensified this effect. The prospect of intimacy with a miniature image attracted people to study these tiny images closely, absorbing the cultural and social messages embedded in the seal owner's choice of motifs. Yet upon the close scrutiny required to see the miniature images, the surface features of the impressions would emerge, highlighting the life-size seal owner as a person, their fingerprints, their choices of where and how deep into the clay to impress the seal, the broader kaleidoscope of neighboring seals belonging to their friends and business partners, even those of different cultural backgrounds. By eluding full intimacy and introducing paradoxical tensions of scale, Hellenistic Babylonian seal impressions called attention to the fact that it was not just miniature gods and heroes, but also the life-size human community that remained visible, accessible, and relevant across the passage of time. In this talk, I have demonstrated how archaeologists and art historians can understand miniatures, such as figurines and seal impressions, through a combination of materiality, tactility, intimacy, and wonder. Miniature objects conditioned the circumstances of their use, the fineness of their details, their receptiveness to the grasping ability of the human hand, their stability when standing alone, their fragility, their surface textures. All these and many other features encouraged or even compelled people to use them in particular ways. Careful attention to these features can therefore yield valuable insights into the function and meaning of the iconography of these miniature objects and of the miniature objects more generally. Now, in general, many miniatures are appealing because they suggest the possibility that the life-size person can gain intimacy with and control over another being, including a being normally more powerful, such as a god or goddess. But small-scale artworks can also elude their users' attempts at full sensory access and immersive escapism. This desire-provoking tension between intimacy and wonder, which lures users into a small-scale encounter only to insist upon the object's life-size existence, is what gives miniature objects their social relevance and the ability to not only reflect, but also to influence the real world. Now, as I move to the last few minutes of my talk, I want to suggest that the study of ancient Middle Eastern art would benefit from the wider application of a scale-based approach to interpretation. Scale has a tremendous impact on how people experience and react to the world. The most obvious use of scalar effect in ancient Mesopotamian art was the construction of temples, monuments, and statues at very large size. The gods themselves were commonly thought of as exceeding human beings in not just power, knowledge, and lifespan, but also in sheer dimensions. Interactions between the divine and human beings thus required scalar mediation. As the houses of the gods, temples were typically larger than human homes, and the grand scale of their construction was often noticeable at a distance, shaping the viewer's first impressions. The immediate effect of gigantic scale had the religious purpose of inspiring pious amazement at the gods themselves. This effect could be continued inside the temple, particularly when cult statues were also made at colossal scale. Kings could also sponsor artworks at grand proportions, inspiring viewers with the magnitude of wealth, resources, and artistry that the object took to create. Now, the observations that I've just made here are hardly unique or novel. Indeed, analysis of monumentality is central to the study of Mesopotamian art. But what is perhaps less commonly studied and remarked upon is the manipulation of gigantic scale, that artworks can be more or less gigantic. Compare these two Neo-Assyrian Lamassu statues, one from the northwest palace of Ashur-nasirpal II at Nimrud, and one from Sargon II's palace, or rather two, from Sargon II's palace at Khorsabad. While we tend to talk about all Neo-Assyrian Lamassu statues as gigantic, if we look at the size of the people here with the Nimrud Lamassu, and then look here at the Lamassu from Khorsabad, these are noticeably larger, towering more over the visitors in the Louvre. These larger Lamassu fit, perhaps, with the godlike bird's eye viewpoint that was newly developed in the sculptural reliefs from Khorsabad, such as this famous seascape scene, where you have this looking down from the heavens bird's eye view. Who sees the ocean from this height? Well, gigantic figures such as these. Enlarging an established benchmark for gigantic scale, making a big Lamassu even bigger, thus could have contributed to the overall meaning of the artistic program of Sargon II's palace. Manipulations of scale can also happen at the nearly life size. Such manipulations of scale receive relatively little attention in scholarship. Sometimes they're just sort of glancingly commented upon, but they might have served a purpose. These minor scalar distortions could call attention to an object, person, or space, slightly emphasizing it or de-emphasizing it, slightly increasing or decreasing its command over a viewer, without completely removing it from the scalar framework of lived reality or placing it within the spectacle of an alternate world, as is done by the gigantic and the miniature. For example, a noticeable feature of the many statues of Gudea erected by this Neo-Sumerian period king at the ancient city of Girsu is that they vary in size. Many of the statues approximate human scale, but with variations of shrinkage or enlargement. While this would have been less noticeable in the ancient context, since these statues were individually displayed in temples, there nevertheless may have been some high-ranking religious officials or state officials, not to mention the king himself, who would have experienced several of these statues in person. What was the effect of seeing Gudea's body shifting in scale from temple to temple across the religious landscape of Girsu? Did he appear to mold himself to fit the dimensions of the space or the cult statue of the deity to whom the temple was dedicated? Or was this less about accommodation and more about an exercise of power, with the king appearing capable of dynamic physical change that could exceed normal human possibilities? Now, I do not have a good answer to this question here today. This is definitely not my area, but I suggest that it and some related questions about scale at the nearly life size, at the gigantic, beyond just saying it's nearly life size, it's gigantic, should and could be asked. And so to conclude, in advocating that miniaturization should be studied more seriously and more systematically, I also recommend that serious scholarly attention needs to be devoted to theorizing other scales, such as the gigantic and the nearly life size, which may entail creating even more finely grained divisions than what I have just glancingly proposed here. Scalar analysis should also be applied to a much wider range of objects. Scholarly attention has typically focused on three-dimensional miniatures, such as figurines and seals. Yet the effects of scale upon the viewer could also be productively explored with coins, jewelry, wall reliefs, painting, non-figural objects, architecture. Among all the properties of ancient Mesopotamian art objects, scale is particularly accessible to modern observation and interpretation, and it has tremendous potential to illuminate ancient society and its values. Buildings, objects, monuments, and other artworks were designed in relationship to living bodies to be experienced by living people. Scale affected them, and so we should remember to let it affect our scholarship as well. Thank you.